This is really inside baseball for people who are in the YIMBY crowd. These are things that you don't hear as one of the culprits of housing obstruction. But when you really get down into the deep sections of the code and the deep sections of the procedures used to issue these permits, these are some of the things that a municipality that is really pro housing can do to get more housing. And the contrary would also be true as well. These are things a municipality who does not want more housing can actually do to prevent housing from being built. Basically, these are examples of when the bureaucracy of the system can get in the way of the ultimate goal, which is to add more housing. And in the state of California, we continue to fall short on our housing goals. This is going to be a conversation about deep, dark bureaucracy and how it affects positively or negatively the goal to get more housing.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, so I'm going to run through the different levers with you, each one by one. Each one identifies a problem, but then I'm sure you're going to come with a solution as well about what can actually be done to resolve the problem. So number one on procedural creep. So the permitting process in practically every major city in America just gets longer and more expensive. But even this happens even when no one is explicitly changing the rules. So why does this seem to keep happening? Why is it so much harder to build as time goes on?
Okay, so say your job is to plan check a set of drawings, and your supervisor establishes these are the 10 things you need to check to make sure that you're doing your job and these drawings are safe. Everything is safe for the public. So you do those 10 things, you're good. Now, what happens over time is there was an 11th thing that wasn't part of the requirements, and it's created an issue on a project. It could be all different types of issues. So now that becomes part of your procedure. Now you have 11 things to check for. This is the most simplistic way I can put it, but now you've increased the amount of efforts that you need to do by 10%. Additionally, now I have to provide one more thing on my drawing, so my effort is increased by 10%. And then the inspector has to inspect for one more thing. So now his effort is increased by 10%. So you actually have a multiplier effect going on here of no less than 3. Now, that was a very simplistic way of looking at it, like just plan checking for one more thing, but it could also be requiring a report on every type of project. So now you're also going to encounter a huge fee and probably a huge time delay. So there is a responsibility for the public entities to streamline these procedures to increase efficiency. And what you also see here is now you have 11 things to plan check for. So now the cost of your job to the customer applying for the permit is also going to go up. So you have an increase in time, an increase in labor, and an increase in cost, all because you've increased the procedure by one notch. And ultimately, that can create obstructive housing policies. So what a municipality that is really serious about getting more homes built, what they're actually going to do is reduce this procedural creep. We can't have 100 permit applications affected by an issue that occurred 1% of the time. So municipalities that are serious about getting more permits issued and more housing built, they're going to have strong management that are able to reduce procedural creep.
Okay, and then on top of the procedural creep, what you talked about oftentimes on this podcast is that suddenly there will be a new reinterpretation of the code that you had never seen before, even though you had been building the similar, if not the same projects for years on end. So talk about what happens when the building department suddenly just decides to throw you that type of curveball out of nowhere.
Yeah, well, the biggest challenge on all of these projects is reducing the amount of risk that you take to do the project. And that goes from the small scale of a homeowner trying to build a singular ADU or an addition to the large scale of a developer trying to build a family building to provide lots of housing. So the reason you need to reduce risk is because risk comes in the form of unexpected costs. And that can throw a project completely out of whack because on the front end of the project, you're doing the math to make sure the project is worth doing, making sure that the costs are reasonable to offset the amount of risk that you take to do the project. So if you all of a sudden have a $20,000 or a $100,000 in one of these elements, whether that could be just fees from the city or whether that could be just a new thing you have to do in construction to meet a requirement, these things just throw the project completely out of whack. So since we've done the project 12 times already, we generally know how to do the project, and we're not expecting that to change on the 13th time we do the project. So hiring somebody who knows what they're doing alleviates your risk. But when they're changing what that process is right in the middle of things because of a new interpretation of a code that we've already been applying, or maybe because of a new procedure, that just throws the whole equation out of whack. So I would say the same solution here would apply to both the first issue you brought up and this issue. The same solution. You need strong management in the building departments to make sure that excessive regulations are not added, but also procedures are not changed. I think it comes down to management of the building department. Good management will avoid these things, and you'll get more permits issued faster, and you'll get more housing.
Yeah, it sounds like they're moving the goalposts in the middle of the project with that one.
Yep.
Let's shift from permitting and municipal code now to housing regulation. So you identified that there's a lot of different housing regulations that get passed that sound reasonable on paper and very common, but then in practice, when it comes to actually when it's time to build a project, then it's actually extremely restrictive. So can you give us some examples of that?
Yeah, no problem. So first off, the one that always comes up is parking, right? But I don't even want to talk about parking because you could approach parking from the perspective of we need more parking, but parking is generally the most common one here. So let's move into something like required square footage for trash. It's just something that seems like very innocuous and something that is also seems like it would be reasonable. In certain municipal codes, there is a requirement for a certain amount of square footage that you need to have for trash. And let's say you have 4 units versus 1 unit. There's going to be different requirements there. Sometimes these requirements can be written in ways that they end up obstructing a project. So here's a kind of a vague example. Let's say you're trying to do 4 units on one property. The code may require something like 240 cubic feet for that trash, the trash that you need to support those 4 units. And it could have additional requirements like minimum length and minimum width. And if you can meet these trash requirements, then no problem. But in some scenarios, especially when you're developing with higher density and you need all these like minimum clearances for ADA and just to make sure tenants can get in and out of their spaces, sometimes the minimum requirements for the trash enclosures can prevent you from actually having that 4th unit or maybe even the 3rd unit. So you have to think about what's important here. If the goal is more housing, some of these regulations should be flexible in order to bend to make things work. So if you can prove that the trash would work in a different capacity, the municipalities should understand that and they should be willing to bend with us to get more housing. But more often than not, we're not seeing that. A municipality that is pro-housing will have somewhat flexible regulations as long as the ultimate goal, the intent of the code, which is adding more housing, is actually happening. Because we want more housing, we don't want to hold fast on these trash regulations. And that's just one example, but this goes across code from trash areas to required open space. If a municipality is going to require a washer and dryer in the unit, it'd be better to have units with no washer dryers than have a requirement to have a washer and dryer in every unit, and then essentially something else is compromised, something else is sacrificed. So flexible regulation and a reasonable approach would be what a municipality who wants to get more housing built would do.
Got it. Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And then compounding this issue is that not only is there oftentimes overburdensome regulation like you just described, but then sometimes you go out of your way to follow the regulation and then the city just completely ignores its own rules or makes up new ones right at the end of the permitting process. So can you give us an example of that? And then ultimately, from your perspective as the architect, what does this actually end up costing in terms of like the project timeline and of course the client's budget as well?
Yeah, this one is highly variable. And that's really the reason this is such an issue. So most of these municipalities that we're dealing with these days have a digital process. And I think the general software everybody's using is some form of this Excel software. And that allows us to interact with the building departments, and then they can interact with us in a very formal procedural way. But that process also can be incredibly restrictive in the sense that you can only do what the parameters of the software is set up to do. And building is not always straightforward. So you can come into a bunch of different scenarios where you're just like, the software cannot handle what needs to happen. And we can't allow the software to control what we build. The software can't control the process. But basically, when we're approaching a project, the key is, again, to alleviate risk. So you do research and you understand what the steps of the process are going to be. If you need a building permit, that generally includes a submittal, a plan check, and then we write revisions, and then we do it again. And we can assume we're going to have 3 of those. And then you move into an issue where in this part of the procedure, you're going to pay up all of your fees, and then the permit gets issued. And different types of permits have different types of processes. Important to understand, because when you take out a construction loan for your project, you're going to be paying every month. So you want to have a general understanding of the time, and that's based on the process. Now, what can happen is because this digital software can be incredibly restrictive, then we need to deviate from the process. That could mean that there's no guarantee from the building departments to get back to us at a reasonable time frame, because the state has now regulated time frames for certain things, especially ADU development, and we know the building department has to get back to us in 60 days. But when you're outside of that process, you haven't made a formal submittal. So maybe you're waiting on an employee to get back to you. And we've easily waited on employees 2 months before they get back to us. So an issue comes up, it can't fit into the system, so they go out of process. Now you don't know how long this is going to take, and you don't totally understand what is required. Are we going to need a submittal? Is it going to be handled in an email? And the other thing that can happen here is there's one issue that takes you out of process, and as you go to respond to that issue, they move the goalposts. Like you said earlier, they're going to move the goalposts, and now there's 2 issues. So that takes a little longer. Because it's not formalized, we're not getting these comments written on DSD letterhead. So when it comes down to it, there's no way to bring this to a supervisor's attention because none of it was clearly established within a process. So having a good process, a well thought out process by management, and then making everybody stick to that process at all costs or whenever possible, as long as it doesn't affect the ultimate intent of getting more housing, that is what a municipality will do that will help developers feel less risk and actually be willing to take on these types of projects to get more housing built.
We'll be talking about management in a second shortly, but first let's talk about public improvement. So we once did a whole podcast about that. I will link that above if people want to actually go check that out. Basically, if you don't know, a public improvement is like a permit for a project. The city might require you to add a sidewalk or some other like public shared space type of amenity. But why don't you talk about this and how it impacts development? Because number one seems to me it's like the thing that not only adds more cost to projects, but could disincentivize a homeowner from doing a project or a developer altogether.
Yeah, and this is one that really affects the small developer or the homeowner more than the larger developer. If you're going to put up a 50-unit apartment complex, you're just going to build a sidewalk, and it all gets rolled into the cost. If you're going to build 2 units in your backyard, you don't have the budget in the project to afford to redo your sidewalk and your curb cut and the street and the alley and all those things that could come with this. So essentially, over time, the different municipalities will establish their standards for things that are off the property, like sidewalks, streets, alleys, and driveways. When you do certain projects, you will trigger that you have to upgrade your projects into these things. So let's say you have a vacant lot and you build a new home. Well, you're going to have to build a sidewalk and you're going to have to pave the street and the curb and get that all up to city standard. And then when you do the driveway, you got to also use the city standard. And if there's an alley, you could be on the hook to do that as well. But additionally to that, let's say you have a house that just has an old sidewalk. So existing home, existing sidewalk, street, alley, everything looks reasonable. It's been used for 50 years, but it's not up to the city's new standard. When you do certain projects, you're going to trigger the demolition of that existing sidewalk and then the repair of that existing sidewalk, or replacement, I should say, so it meets the city standards. And these things have huge price tickets. They require an additional permit, which requires more engineering. So essentially, anytime you trigger public improvements on even the smallest project, if you're talking about doing let's just say a sidewalk, that's going to be about $50,000. So this is a real cost implication, especially on a project that's $500,000 or less. It's 10% of your project budget right there. So one more important point, and I think this is probably the strongest point here. When the state of California created their ADU regulations, they were really explicit about ADUs not triggering public improvements. Why do you think they did that, Billy?
Because the type of person that's going to be developing an ADU project is going to be the small homeowner on a tight budget. So it would make sense, in theory, to give them a exemption from that.
Exactly. And that's ultimately the goal. If we want cities to build organically, is we want the homeowner to be able to do these projects. So if the state has recognized that this creates obstruction to new housing development in the form of ADUs, the cities should also realize that same obstruction applies to smaller projects like a new dwelling unit behind an existing dwelling unit, which is possible in multifamily zones, or in addition to a single family dwelling unit, which you could also trigger these things. So maybe it could be required when you develop a blank lot, a vacant lot, but I think there should be some reasonability if there's an existing sidewalk, or potentially we can raise the thresholds so that the smaller projects don't trigger these things. Because, creating an entire new sidewalk can actually make a client not want to go through these types of projects. And then it does become an obstruction to housing.
Well, I think it's insane that 10% of a project budget could be to put in like a sidewalk. And if people want to check out the video we did about it, basically, it's a completely counterproductive way about going about things, as they'll discover if they watch that video anyway. But speaking of insane things, so let's talk about rogue city employees now. This is one of the things you identified. So can you talk about when, or if this has ever even happened to you, when a employee of the building department has like a personal disagreement with something in the project and goes out of their way without the manager or building department supervision to block the project, even though within the municipal code it should be allowed?
Yes. So we've had several examples of this happening. Generally, the way this happens, and I'm going to intentionally be vague about this, is you're on a phone call or possibly a video call. So this is not done in writing. And as you're discussing what the intent of a code is and which way to proceed from a very specific scenario, the municipal employee basically reveals why they're having an issue with this whatever the specific thing is. And in my experience, it generally comes down to density, and certain city employees do not agree with the amount of density that the state or certain municipalities will allow us to have. And then because of that, they can intentionally obstruct a project through different levers. One would be one we've experienced personally, would be adding new plan check requirements, which are not part of their documented process. And another one would be sending you into a wild goose chase out of procedure and essentially stalling construction of projects. And we've also discussed this with several colleagues who are experiencing the same thing. So it's not unique to my projects or my business. So when you have policies written in the municipal code, there's a set of checks and balances, and everything goes through city council, and they ultimately get approved with public input. So there's kind of like a democratic way this all, for the most part, not always, but for the most part. So once that process is established and part of the code, it's very strange to me that one person, and the people I'm talking about here have a lot of influence. So sometimes there could be only a few supervisors above them, or in some cases, one supervisor above them. So they're almost always at the top. They have a lot of sway, and they've been working in this capacity for a long time. But it's basically a singular employee's job is working for the building department. So you think they would be pro-building, working in a way that is against the democratic process of the people and City Hall to implement their personal beliefs.
Crazy. Nothing else to say about that one. Moving on to hidden fee structure. So this is something else. This is the last item you identified. So talk about when, in order to favor or put restrictions on one type of housing unit over the other, cities can use a hidden fee structure to financially incentivize development or lack thereof in a certain direction. So can you talk about hidden fee structures and what you're seeing?
Yeah, I'll actually use some specifics for this one because I think this is easy to research. Let's say in the city of San Diego, you wanted to build a single family home, and on another property, same exact size lot, same zone, you want to build an ADU, and then on same size property, you want to build a townhome. So 3 different types of projects, and you're going to pay 3 types of fees. So the ADU for plan check and inspection right now in City of San Diego is $16,500. That's up from about $5,000 5 years ago. So it's more than tripled in price in the last 5 years. If you wanted to build a single family home the same size as the ADU, you're going to pay roughly the same. If you want to build a townhome, you're billed $24,000, which is about $8,000 more than the ADU. So right away, if you have the option to build a townhome or the ADU, you may lean towards the ADU because you're going to save $8,000 or so on the ADU. Now, if we really want to incentivize people to do these projects, especially smaller scale people, homeowners and small infill developers like Margaret and I, and we want to create an advantage for the smaller people than we do for the larger people doing these giant apartment buildings, the ones that people are complaining about, by the way. So if we want to incentivize the smaller scale development, which is generally what you want, then the smaller scale projects should be incentivized over the larger ones. So let's just compare, let's take 2 scenarios here. If you're going to do a dwelling unit or an ADU, if they're the same price, you'd probably just do the dwelling unit. But if you reduce the fees in the ADU, if we can get the fees back to where they were in 2022 or 2021, more people would build these ADUs. But since the fee has increased like $10,000, people on a shoestring budget, that becomes an obstruction. People trying to do a $200,000 ADU, a $10,000 added cost, that's 5%. That's huge. So you reduce the fees in the units that you want to get built. Now, right now in San Diego, we have the mayor about to unveil a program where we're going to have an incentive, or where he's going to try to incentivize smaller homes to be built and townhomes to be built. But at the same time, you have an increase in townhome fees, $24,000 to build a townhome right now. That could be 20% of the cost of the townhome. So you have this duplicitous speak. One guy saying, hey, we're going to do all these really cool things. And that's the guy that he's the most public facing person in the equation. So he's telling us as people who live in the city, this is what he wants. But then you have on the backside, slowly the Development Services Department increasing these costs significantly over the last 5 years. So yeah, I guess this could be a Secret Code Club podcast, a conspiratorial one, but you have to ask yourself, why do the fees keep increasing if we actually want to get these homes built? Maybe that brings us back full circle to point number 1. If you continue to creep the procedures, you can justify increasing the costs of all those procedures. So it becomes a little bit of a cyclical problem, a bureaucratic mess.
Sure. Well, the thing you didn't mention, but people could infer, is that the prices have gone up, but then the service has just gotten worse at the same time. So you're paying for the permitting processing timelines have never been longer at the same time as the cost also has never been higher. So I guess zooming out in conclusion here, what would you kind of say to people, or what could be solutions to these problems at a very high level?
At a very high level, you got to start with a really clear, if the agenda is pro-housing, which is what they're telling us it is, and what some municipalities, you can compare the difference between City of San Diego and Coronado, and it's pretty clear Coronado is not as pro-housing as the City of San Diego. But the goal, the housing goal, needs to be pushed down to the supervisor level, and then it needs to be followed through with all of the procedures and the policies. And if you can align all that stuff, it's very clear how a municipality can shift things into a pro building scenario. And it's very clear how they could also shift it the other way if they really don't want people to build certain things or anything.
So to wrap up here then, there's a lot of traps that we discussed in the entire permitting process to get a project actually built after it's designed. So why don't you just talk about how you and your studio helps clients navigate the permitting process?
Yeah, so man, there's so many pitfalls in the process. And if you're approaching a project, your goal is alleviating as much risk as possible, because you don't want to be working on a small ADU and then you get hit with a dollar report right in the permitting phase. So to the greatest extent possible, working with Margaret, who's an ex-employee of the building department and a permit specialist, we like to take a kind of design approach where we're also considering permitting all the way on the front end of things. And if we can establish where the thresholds lie, we can steer around them and make sure that we can get things built efficiently. Now, I'm not saying cheap housing. I'm saying don't pay fees that don't contribute to getting housing built, and don't pay fees that don't contribute to making housing better. So we're eliminating unnecessary fees. When the building department changes these procedures in the middle of the project, that throws a curveball our way. And then we have to take a role where we become an advocate for the project and an advocate for the homeowner, our client. And then we have to establish a bunch of meetings and stuff, and all of that adds cost. So we're pretty good at avoiding that. It's almost impossible to completely avoid this on every project in the city of San Diego where we do most of our work. But that's what we're trying to do here. It's an integrated permit and design process. And then we follow through the whole thing until we take your projects from where it is now, a concept stage, all the way through permitting, and then through completion of construction.
And then if people want to learn more about you, the studio, check out the portfolio, or all that type of stuff, what's the best way for them to learn more about the firm and then get in touch ultimately?
So start with the website, 1070architecture.com. You could check out the Instagram, where I'm slowly adding all of our projects to the page. That's at architecture. And this YouTube channel has a bunch more content. If you like this video, there's more videos like this that you will also enjoy.